we'll get into things some more. All right. Well, thanks for joining us today, y'all. It's great to have a couple folks with us here to talk about our remote monitoring tool Lens and how we work with our partners in the land trust community to help provide access to some really neat tools for monitoring and stewardship using satellite and aerial imagery. My name is Jake Faber. I've been with Upstream for about a year or so. I came to Upstream from the Land Trust Alliance, where I used to help land trusts figure out how to navigate this space and learn how to get started with some of these different technologies. So we'll today be going over just what Lens is all about and some considerations for getting started here. Make sure to get to any questions y'all have at the end. So as I said, feel free to drop any questions you've got in the chat. So by way of background, Upstream is a mission-driven tech company. Our software tools that we develop help to accelerate the pace, the scale, and the impact of conservation. We've got a great team of now over 30 folks on board here, including Alexis and Clay, who are with us today. They'll be helping me out with moderating the chat and answering questions at the end. And we've got folks on our team who have experience ranging from software engineering and remote monitoring to conservation and environmental science. So our goal for our whole team is really quite simple: to make remote sensing accessible with a really easy to use tool that's focused on conservation. Historically, these are the types of tools that have been really tough for a lot of us to access. And so what we really try to do is create an easy to use web-based application that serves as this one-stop shop for commercial satellite and aerial data. There are all sorts of really cool applications of that. We'll walk through what some of those might look like and some of the different data sources that we work with most commonly in Lens. But what this means is that you can really hone in on the particular properties or areas of interest that you have that you're trying to monitor or manage. And you can use all sorts of tools for monitoring, reporting, as well as analyzing changes in the landscape and potentially even alerting your team to changes that you might not otherwise be aware about. So some of the things that you might be interested in doing with Lens and motivations for why land trusts choose to do this sort of work are all over the map, but a couple of the big ones: being able to detect changes quickly and easily, things like violations, new structures, changes to habitat. Even thinking at a longer time scale, looking at things like the impact of restoration work. Here we can see a really cool tree planting example, for instance, where it's really clear to be able to identify those trends over time. We also make it really easy to identify things like disturbance impacts from issues ranging from wildfire to pest damage, timber harvest, anything where there's that change on the landscape that we can track over time. In this case, looking at a wildfire in Northern California and seeing some of the impacts to vegetation health. Now, as I mentioned before, we also have some ways of alerting your team to potential changes that you might not be aware about. In this case, we have some neat features around automated alerting for changes in vegetation health. So in this case, looking at a timber harvest in California. We'll go over this a little bit more when we start to walk through Lens and some of the different features a little more specifically, but some really neat tools that can be really helpful for that as well. Along similar lines, we also recently launched a new feature for helping to understand changes in parcel ownership. So if there's a change to who owns a property that you are managing perhaps an easement on, or maybe an adjacent landowner that you want to build a relationship with, this could be a great tool for helping to understand some of those changes when they happen. We also make it really easy to share any of the insights that you're drawing from using all these tools in whatever way is most helpful to you, so that you can share these insights externally. We've got some reporting features that I'll walk through in a little bit, as well as some ways to integrate more directly with some of the database and GIS tools that you might already be familiar with or using in your existing work. Now, with Lens, we provide access to a bunch of different data sources. Some of these are public data, some of these are commercial data. And we try to make it really easy for you to pick and choose on a case-by-case basis what different data sources are going to work best for answering the kinds of questions you have. Fundamentally, that's something I always come back to here, is that the methods you use should be driven by the questions you're trying to answer. So we try to have some tools available for answering all sorts of different questions. That might look like using, as we have over here on the left-hand side, some examples of really high-resolution commercial satellite imagery, or maybe also something that's a little more high frequency that's helpful for looking at landscape scale trends. So a couple different examples here of what that might look like in practice across different scales. And again, we'll show some examples in just a moment of what these look like in practice. As I said, Lens is something that we built specifically for folks in conservation. Historically, satellite and aerial imagery has been applied for all sorts of different industries, ranging from defense to insurance, real estate. Those of us in conservation are, pretty new to this space. These tools are always getting better and better. The cost is always becoming more and more accessible. And so Lens really, sort of serves this role of trying to make it easy for folks that are trying to have a positive impact in conservation anywhere in the world to access those tools really easily with this diverse built-in toolkit that we make available just, getting in with one click. We also make it easy to add your whole portfolio into Lens. We don't have any acreage limits or number of properties that you're able to upload. So any properties, for instance, that you may hold easement interests on, or that you may hold in fee, maybe even properties you're thinking about acquiring, or lands that you're interested in understanding within your geography, you're welcome to pull into Lens so that you can understand what's going on. We also, again, with those reports, make it really easy to meet land trust standards and practices with one click, just getting in and being able to understand exactly what's going on in the landscape and have verifiable information. And again, being able to use Lens with GIS and other database tools makes it really easy to integrate with your existing workflow. We've got a bunch of folks who are using Lens now. We're really excited to say that we've got some great partnerships with folks like the Nature Conservancy, Forest Service, a bunch of other land trusts and conservation organizations around the country and internationally. Right now, we've got over 150 organizations that are working with us to monitor now over 23 million acres worth of land. Last count, I think that's larger than the state of Indiana, which we're really excited about. And we also keep the pricing as affordable as possible, specifically for nonprofits. We have special rates. We also have special partnerships with a few land trust state associations to help make these tools more accessible for folks, particularly in Idaho and Colorado right now. But we have two different subscription options for you to pick from. We'll talk through some of the different features and things like that of what might guide your decisions to choose one of those. But I also just wanted to quickly note that right now, I know probably a handful of you are coming to us, after all the excitement of the Land Trust Alliance rally recently. So we do have a special discount that we're running for 10% off your first year. This is a discount code. I'll share that later with you, but feel free to jot that down if that's something that might be of interest to you. So a couple nice things that folks have said about us recently. I always really like pointing to some of our existing partners that have used these tools to build capacity on their teams and really just take their conservation work further, recognizing that we're often working with limited resources and trying to do the best with what we've got. Our friend over at Maryland Environmental Trust, John Chapman, has said that Lens allows us to see the full extent of our properties versus just what we would normally see when focusing, meeting up with a landowner or only seeing what the landowner chooses to take us to see on a drive. As well as one of our friends over at Colorado Open Lands saying nonprofits are often tasked with doing more with less, and remote monitoring with Lens being a great tool for doing just that. Again, folks come to us interested in these tools for all sorts of different reasons. So whatever that looks like for you, we're happy to help you out, but really excited to partner with folks in the land trust space. So with that, hopefully gives you a bit of a high level overview of some of the main points and considerations to be thinking about as you're getting started here, what Lens is all about. I feel like it's probably most helpful though to just get in and sort of take a look. So again, as questions come up, if there are things you'd like me to dig into a little bit more later during the Q&A, feel free to drop those notes down for us and we'll get to them later. So Lens, as I said, is a web-based application. A couple things that means. This is a tool that you can access from any web-connected device. You don't have to download any software to your machine. And this keeps it really accessible for folks who may be on your team wanting to just go in and see what some of the areas of interest they're working on might look like. So we break this down into different portfolios for different regions where we've got some areas of interest, but maybe for you that looks like having different projects that you manage for, say, easements or fee-owned lands or acquisitions or so forth. Now, if we go into one of these portfolios, let's say, so I'm based in Philadelphia, so up here in my neck of the woods, we've got a handful of properties that we have in this region that we manage all in this portfolio. So as you can see, we've got a couple just organizational tools. As you would imagine, some organizations we work with have a lot of properties that they're trying to manage, so keeping those up to date and easy to find is always important. You can customize any tags here so that if you have particular properties that have certain interests that you want to keep in mind, these are the ones that we've loaded for this particular site, but there are any number that you can choose from here or create. So maybe if we've got some follow-up that we need to do, we can keep trying. Again, we also make it really easy to collaborate with other folks on your team. So if you have folks who might be managing a certain subset of your portfolio, you can make those assignments and filter down so that, for instance, we know exactly who is monitoring what. So once you get into Lens and get started with your account, first thing you're going to want to do is get in and add some properties, right? And again, this can look like either properties that you hold an active interest on or just an area of interest that you have. So you can upload right here any shapefiles or KMLs. You also will be able to draw any boundaries right within this map if that's something that's easier for you, recognizing that we have organizations we work with that range from having on-staff GIS experts to really more limited technological capacity that want to get in and do this. So making that easy for you. Now, if we get into sort of the meat of things here, we can go and look at any one of these properties. And let's start with this one in Eastern Massachusetts. This is a site where there's been some ongoing wetland restoration work over about the last decade or so. And so there's a lot of really interesting things that we can see here that have occurred over that time. So really quickly, you'll note that this is a really familiar web map kind of interface, right? So it's something that if you use Google Earth, Google Maps, like just about anybody can get in and understand pretty quickly. So we have different base maps, for instance, that can help give you some context as to where this property is located. And you'll also see that we have the internal perimeter right here is the actual property boundary. And I'll note that we always also include this buffer area. Usually it's about 300 to 500 feet, depending on the size of the property, recognizing that things like boundary encroachments are always going to be important to keep an eye on. So we just kick that in at no charge whenever you load in a new image. Now, over here, you can see a number of the different data sources that we currently have are able to pull up for this site. So if we wanted to go back and take a look at what was going on in December of 2021, we can pull that image up quite quickly. Now, like I said, we have access to a bunch of different data sources in Lens. So it's up to you to decide on a case-by-case basis what's going to work best for you, depending on the questions that you have. So again, we have data from public sources as well as commercial sources. The public sources we load in and they're ready to go as soon as you get started in here. So those are going to be some of the data sources that maybe you've heard about, include the USDA's NAEP program, which for most states comes in usually on in every 2 or 3 years cadence. And then we also have data from the European Space Agency, which is coarser resolution, but comes in at much higher frequency. So that comes in globally every 5 days. So some really interesting use cases we can talk about there. But for most folks, what they're looking to get into just off the bat, especially for something like an annual compliance monitoring visit, is going to be accessing the highest resolution you can get your hands on during the current calendar year. So if that's the case, we can come over here and see what all of these different images are that are available from the commercial vendors that we work with. And so you'll see different specifications and names here. These are just all the different sources that we have. So you might choose any one of these for a given property, again, depending on the conditions. So let's say, for instance, that we're interested in getting one of the higher resolution images that we can find here, maybe 30 to 50 centimeter resolution. We can see that if we're looking back again for 2021 here, we go down from having maybe a sum total of like 100 to 150 images to a more manageable 15 to 20 to choose from that meet the specific needs that we have. For this part of the world, we often think about monitoring in the early spring when there's not as much snow cover, not as much canopy cover. So maybe this time in early March is going to fit the bill. If that's the case, we can go over here and preview this image. So this is an image that already exists from, in this case, Maxar's imagery archive. So as these companies like Maxar, Airbus, Planet are going around the world and capturing imagery every day, they then have this vast archive of images that we're able to tap into. So once we decide that this is an image that we want, we can go ahead and order that and stream it in from the vendor for you to start using. Usually takes about 10 minutes or so. Typically, the processing of these images is also really fast. So when an image is captured, we usually get access to it within about 24 hours or so, depending on the vendor. So in this case, this is a 500-acre property, and we're ordering imagery for the whole site. And so at 8 cents an acre, this one's going to run us about 40 bucks. So if we go ahead and order that, that's then what we'll pull over into our little library here that we can start working with. Now, if we didn't want to order that whole property, we also can do just a partial order. Maybe we want the southern portion of this property, and we can go back and again select that same image. And instead, that's going to run us for just about 250 acres, 20 bucks. So once we go in and access some of this imagery, that's then when we really can start to do some interesting things with that, right? And again, I'll just say that this is one of several ways that you can access data within Lens. So we can go through and find all of these archive images. If you decide that you want a little bit more control over the imagery that you get, you can also be the one to say, hey, Airbus, I would like an image of this location at this particular time. That's a process called tasking, and that's something we can help you out with as well. The trade-off is that usually the archive imagery is something we always point to first, because if there's an archive image that's going to fit the bill, it's always going to be cheaper than a tasking option. But whichever one you choose, we're always happy to help you out with that. So once we've gotten oriented to Lens, loaded our properties, ordered some imagery, now we can actually start to do things with it, which is really cool, right? So if we go ahead and want to do some comparisons, let's say, for instance, I mentioned this is an ongoing wetland restoration project. We can see maybe what that has looked like over a sort of longer time scale. So looking from July of 2003 to July of this year, we can really quickly see that, let's zoom in a little bit here. So these are some old cranberry bogs, and we can see that they have added this pond for some waterfowl habitat. This dirt road over here, you can see was renaturalized in that time. And over here, these bogs were restored to a more natural stream flow. So we can really quickly compare those changes over time and then document them. So what we can do is we can make notes for anything that we see on this property that we might want to share with the rest of our team or share externally. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to create a note about a particular area. I could drop a polygon, I could drop a point, I can add specific coordinates if perhaps you have a photo point or some specific location you always refer back to. And then I can just document what I see. So in this case, let's go and take a look at, for instance, maybe let's take a look just over at this part of the property. If I pull up this image, I can see these fence lines, I can see the center line of the road, power lines. So giving you a sense of sort of what you can see at that scale. Now, if I go over to this part of the property, I can see that between these two dates, I noticed that this house site had been cleared and the foundation is being laid. And then if we wanted to, let's say, get a more recent update from a couple weeks later, you can see that there's some construction equipment there and they're still working on that site. So as we've gone along and started making these observations, taking notes, the next thing we can do is we can really easily spit out a report that pulls all the information about these sites for us to refer back to or share, for instance, with the Accreditation Commission if we're going through a renewal process or anything like that. So here we can see the overview of this property, and we can select any of those images that we have to work from to be that sort of reference point. And then we also have all of the metadata associated with that. So we know when that image was captured, even down to the capture time in a lot of cases. So for that verification, being able to go back, it really helps us to see that. Now, for any of these observations that we made, we also can go in and, for instance, zoom in on a particular location, see where on the property that was. Again, metadata for both of these source images. We can see what we observed, who made that observation, when they made that observation. And that's the case for any of these. So now that we've gone in, sort of made some observations, just manually going back and forth with these slider bars, that's sort of, I would say, the most basic way that you can get in and start to understand some of these changes on the landscape, right? And the cool thing is that you can do this to identify those back corners that you always have a hard time getting to, or even a lot of folks will use this to help prep for a field visit even. If you know that your boundaries are all in good shape and you're not suspecting any encroachments, you can maybe focus your priorities on the higher risk areas where you suspect there's something going on that maybe you want to follow up with, and so forth. Now, what's really cool about some of these data sources is we can even see things that the human eye can't see. So far, we've just been looking at these true color images to really be able to see the landscape in a way that reflects as if we were up above it. Now, here's an example of a site down in coastal South Louisiana, where, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar, there's a lot of issues with land subsidence and land loss. And so we can use some of these public data sources that I'd mentioned to really get a sense of how that sort of long time scale landscape change occurs. So for instance, we could take a look at trends in surface water or surface moisture to understand things that, again, we really just can't see in these little like nuanced shades of blues and greens. So if, for instance, I wanted to understand how surface water trends might be affecting this coastal area, I can use our Analyze Area tool and specify a part of that property where we want to get a sense of how that's been changing over time. So if we take a look back to early in 2015 is how far back we can go for this particular data source, we can see those sensings from just about every 5 days. And you can see this trend that going from, let's pull perhaps one of these start dates there to compare to a more recent time, we can see where that land has disappeared and where the surface water has now infiltrated. So all sorts of cool things you can do with that, not just for things like coastal erosion, but also maybe in this case, looking at timber harvest and understanding the impacts of that on the vegetation. So we could use things like a vegetation index, which basically is a proxy for telling us how much photosynthesis is occurring on the landscape. Darker colors here correspond to more vegetation vigor. Some of you might be familiar with this index called the NDVI, or Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And in this case, one of the really cool things we can do is we can use these vegetation changes to get automated alerts when there's been something out of the ordinary occurring on this property. So in this case, there was a drop detected at this particular date. If I go to this location, I can see that our machine learning algorithm that drives these alerts estimated this was the perimeter of that change. So if there are basically 3 sensings in a row where this change persists, it's going to tag us as saying, hey, there's something going on here you might want to check out. In this case, pulling up those 2 dates, we can see that clearly something changed there that really suddenly affected this vegetation, right? And if we go in and compare that to the true color data, we can see that sure enough, there was a timber harvest there, and this is about the boundary of the clear cut. So all sorts of neat things that you can do with that. And you'll see here that one of the other alert features that we have is also relating to those parcel ownership changes. So over here, going back to Massachusetts example, we can see that these are all of the different parcels associated with the county or municipal records that are on file. We work with a partner called Regrid, which aggregates all of that data nationally so that we can get very frequent updates of this information. And so then we can compare if there's, say, been a change where this parcel has changed hands, we can see when that occurred. And if that means that we have a new landowner that we might want to be working with or a new neighbor we want to get to know, then we can really easily do that. So that's a sort of quick walkthrough of a bunch of the different features that we have here in Lens. I'll hop back over here just to this sort of main page and note that, again, it's really easy for you to get in and access the data that you need and be able to organize this in a way that works for you. Of course, with the number of land trusts all around the country doing wildly different types of work in different types of landscapes, we recognize that it's always really helpful to be able to take those sorts of tools in ways that work best in your specific situation. So with that, we've got all sorts of other resources on our website that you're welcome to check out. I'm happy to talk more to anybody who has specific questions. But otherwise, feel free to drop any thoughts you have, anything you'd like me to talk a little bit more about in that Q&A box. Otherwise, Alexis, I'll hand it over to you if you want to punt any further questions my way.
Yeah, I'll make sure to keep checking that Q&A box. So please drop in any questions that you folks have here today. But I'll throw you one, Jake, that we get quite a lot that people might be interested in. So could you talk a little bit more about parcel data and alerts and how that fits into a typical conservation easement monitoring process that a lot of land trusts use?
Yeah, of course. So let's hop back over to this example here, just so you can see, again, what this looks like. So typically, and this is especially relevant for folks that work with conservation easements, right? Like as organizations that support voluntary private lands conservation, making sure you know who those landowners are and know whose interests sort of lie overlapping with any properties or adjacent to any properties that you are working with. It's always great to just know that information going into this. I've heard so many stories about land trusts that try to access this information by poring over really arcane records, trying to figure out oh, who might this owner be, and has this changed from last year, and making those comparisons. So having a way to do this in a more seamless, less time-consuming way is something that folks have been asking us for ages. So there are all sorts of details about how this process works that we have in our support documentation on our website. But just a couple other details to note here that folks often ask about. So we get updates on these parcel changes quarterly from Regrid. They're the ones, again, that aggregate this information for us. And so when there has been a change that intersects with any area on your property here, that's when you'll get these alerts. So for instance, this one over here, we can see overlaps with this corner. So it's going to flag that for us. Yeah, again, all sorts of other interesting ways that you can use this, but especially for land trusts. You know, I know this is something that often folks are incorporating to understand, you know, just making sure that folks are in line with the terms of conservation easement. You have to know who is responsible for that and who you ought to be engaging with. So hopefully this is something that's really helpful for y'all.
Great. I have another one for you, Jake. So could you talk a little bit more about the GIS integrations, and could you maybe share some of the benefits of being able to get imagery directly into GIS software?
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a good one. So let's take a look. Maybe let's go back to this property as an example. I'll just clean this up a little bit for us. So, you know, again, we try to make Lens accessible for folks to get in and interact with data in a way that does not really require any like wrangling of high-res raster files or anything like that. Try to remove all those headaches for you. But if you're the type of person who really wants to take this imagery and do some sort of you know, custom analysis, or maybe you want to use it for some sort of cartographic work where going and integrating that into a GIS platform is helpful to you, we've got a couple ways that you can do that. So if we come over here, we can see all the details about this layer that we've loaded right now. So this one, again, is from Airbus. It's a 50-centimeter resolution image from late July. And so here are a couple of things that we can do. So first off, and maybe the easiest, is we have what's called a web map tile server link. So whether you're using ARC or QGIS or any other open source platform, you can just copy this link over and it will pull all of these commercial layers that you've ordered so that you can interact with those right in your GIS platform. So as long as you've got your Lens account open, it's going to be very easy for you to basically have the same visualization over in your GIS platform if that's something that you're looking for. Now, if you also want to have a GeoSIF download, we can do that for any of the Airbus images as well. And then this goes for images from all of our vendors. We also can do PNG downloads. Those aren't going to be geo-referenced, but if you want, for instance, a high-res image to share back with your landowner, just so they can see what their property is looking like or something along those lines, that's a really great resource too. I'll also note that along similar lines, as far as like integrations with other platforms, folks often ask about some of the conservation database tools like Landscape and Locate. If those are systems that you also use, any of the notes that you make in Lens can push into those platforms too. I know for Landscape in particular, any of these notes that you make will come in as issues if you have that integration set up. Basically, we have an API integration. So if you want that when you're getting started with Lens, you can just let the folks at your database provider know what you need and can help get set up there. Yeah, Alexis, any other questions coming through at the moment?
Yep, we did have another couple come through. So with Lens, are you able to do inventory of trees and planted seedlings?
Ooh, that's a good question. So there's all sorts of tools that we might be able to use for understanding forest conditions and just generally, you know, I guess let's start here with this 50-centimeter resolution image, right? So like we can see individual trees with this. When you're thinking about, again, which tools are going to be the best to answer the specific question you have, spatial resolution and frequency are always going to be top of mind. So if, for instance, you want to look at a tree planting, actually over here, I think we had, let me see which slide this was. Let's go back a little bit. Believe, yeah, right here. So this is a tree planting project, for instance. So if you wanted to quantify the area of canopy coverage here, you could do that pretty easily with that analyze area tool that I showed you, which again is going to pull that data for vegetation from every 5 days going back in time. Whether you want to go in and like do a manual count of that, you also probably can. Again, it just depends on the size of the impact that you're looking at and which resolution you choose. Now, we also do have a couple of other data layers related to carbon projects, which I'll show you this example over here in California. We have, for instance, so we partner with a company called Salo Sciences, which models things like canopy cover, canopy height, and I think most interestingly, this above ground carbon layer, which is really cool. So here they're modeling above ground carbon at 3-meter resolution. And so we can see, for instance, where there's been, let's say in this part of the property between these two sensings. We've got 2016 and 2020. We can see what that change has looked like and quantify that. And so over here, using that same analyze area feature, we can track the actual metrics. So some really cool opportunities there for folks that are involved in more carbon project work.
And Jake, you actually just hit on one of our last questions, which was a bit more info about Lens for Carbon. I will say we are at times, so maybe if you want to point folks to some of our other Lens for Carbon resources.
Yeah, so plenty more information on our website as well. I'll just pull up again. My email is right here, jake@upstream.tech. Feel free to be in touch. Happy to talk through any questions you've got and share some more resources if this is something that seems up your alley. So thanks again for joining us. And Alexis, thanks for helping me out with the Q&A here. Good to see y'all.